Welcome to What Going On channel. Today, we're bringing you a brand new explainer on something truly foundational. We are talking about the actual engine of a multi-trillion-dollar economy and looking at exactly how a nation literally measures its own pulse. So here's the deal. India's statistical framework has just gone through one of its most massive, significant modernizations in over a decade. The Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, or MoSPI for short, has completely overhauled how the country measures industrial growth, consumer inflation, and overall economic size. To really wrap our heads around this, we're going to visually map out these changes on the whiteboard right in front of you. Now, as we sketch out the big picture in our main frame here, definitely keep an eye out for our smaller keyword frame. It's going to pop up to define some crucial terminology as we go. We're breaking down the new data series across three big ones: the Index of Industrial Production, the Consumer Price Index, and Gross Domestic Product. It's a huge update, and it literally changes the lens through which we view one of the world's largest economies.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap sketching out on screen right now. First, the Great Statistical Overhaul. Second, updating the Industrial Scorecard. Third, measuring modern living costs. Fourth, rebasing the grand total. And finally, why these numbers matter. Let's get to it.
Section 1. Updating the Industrial Scorecard. We're going inside the IIP. Now, direct your attention to that smaller glossary frame popping up on your screen. As it writes out the definition for base year, let me just explain why this is absolutely critical. A base year acts as the standard reference point, right? It's mathematically set to an index value of exactly 100. This is the starting line. Think of it kind of like setting the tare weight on a kitchen scale to 0 right before you pour in your flour. By setting the base year to exactly 100, if the index hits 105 the next year, boom, we instantly know there's been a 5% growth. Without this anchor, the numbers are basically meaningless. Establishing this 100-point reference is the critical first step for measuring any sort of economic growth. And to make sure the index actually stays relevant to the times, this base year has to be periodically updated.
Watch as we slowly trace this really fascinating historical timeline across the main board. The shift to the 2022-23 base year, that actually marks the 10th revision in India's history. It starts way back in 1937, prior to independence, which is when the first base year was established. Then, as the line moves over to the early independence era from 1946 to 1960, we see successive updates to track what was a newly industrializing nation. The line continues right into the late 20th century, with periodic updates in 1970, 1981, and 1993-94. And that last one is exactly when India's markets underwent that massive liberalization and opened up to the world. Moving into the modern era from 2004 to 2012, those revisions perfectly reflect the incredible rise of the IT and digital services boom. Finally, our timeline arrives at the current overhaul of 2022-23, which modernizes the basket for today's economy. It just beautifully illustrates how the index must constantly adapt to an evolving nation.
Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer scale of the upgrade to the IIP. Remember, the IIP is the definitive monthly scorecard of India's industrial health, released by the National Statistical Office to track physical output across actual factories. Look at this comparison grid taking shape. The base year shifts from 2011-12 to 2022-23. But check out the product basket. It jumps from 839 items across 407 groups to a massive 1,042 items across 463 groups. We are tracking so much more now. And the granularity? Vastly improved. Under the old series, electricity data was just combined into one giant lump number. Now, as it sketches out, it's specifically split into renewable versus non-renewable sources. And why does that matter? Because tracking green energy separately from fossil fuels is absolutely crucial for measuring India's modern climate goals. Mining is also broken down now into fuel, metallic, and non-metallic minerals. We are getting a much higher resolution picture of the factory floor.
Let's activate our smaller glossary frame again. We're sketching out the definition for gross value added, or GVA. GVA is basically the measure of the value of goods and services produced in an area, industry, or sector of an economy. Let me give you a super simple example. Say a baker buys flour for 10 rupees and sells the baked bread for 50 rupees. The GVA is the 40 rupees of actual value they added to those raw materials. MoSPI uses this exact concept to figure out which industries are actually adding the most value to the economy today. By updating the weightages using the latest GVA data directly from the 2022-2023 National Account Statistics, it ensures that the most economically important industries have the exact correct amount of influence on the final index number.
As these bullet points get sketched onto the main board, notice the expanded scope of sector coverage here. The core trio that we've always tracked,
Mining, manufacturing, and electricity, that is absolutely retained. But look at what's being added to the list. Gas supply, water supply, and sewerage and waste management. The index now covers these modern civic utilities as an entirely new sector. And guys, this is a huge shift. As India rapidly urbanizes, dealing with waste is no longer just some local civic duty. It's a massive, measurable industrial sector. It's a fundamental recognition of just how vital organized utility and waste management infrastructure has become to the modern economic landscape.
And this right here brilliantly illustrates the reality of changing times. Watch as we literally visually erase the outdated items on the left side of the board. Stuff like kerosene, fluorescent tubes, bicycle tire tubes. These have been completely deleted from the tracked basket. Poof, gone. And in their place on the right, we're sketching in modern commodities, CCTV cameras, medical stents, aircraft parts, and magnetic stripe cards. It's honestly almost humorous to think about dropping bicycle tubes to make room for aircraft parts and stents, but it perfectly and vividly captures just how radically modern consumption and production has shifted and advanced over the last decade.
Section 2. Measuring modern living costs. Let's take a look inside the CPI. Okay, so while the industrial index measures the factory floor, the consumer price index, or CPI, measures the actual cost of living by tracking the price changes of everyday goods and services purchased by everyday households. Watch this massive number being drawn on your screen, 4%. This is a vitally important number to understand because the CPI is the single most critical economic indicator for the Reserve Bank of India. The RBI actually has a strict legal mandate to keep CPI inflation exactly at this 4% mark, operating within a very tight tolerance band of 2% to 6%. If the inflation rate measured by the CPI breaches that 6% ceiling, major economic alarms go off and the central bank literally has to hit the brakes on the economy immediately. That is exactly why the accuracy of this index is completely non-negotiable.
Let's look at how the inflation measurement framework has shifted. As this table is drawn out, you can see the base year is jumping from 2012 to 2024. The basket size is increasing from 299 goods and services to a highly detailed 358 goods and services. And where's this new list coming from? It's driven entirely by the new source data, the 2023-24 Household Consumption Expenditure Survey. This finally moves us away from decade-old consumption patterns. I mean, think about what changed in our households between 2011 and 2024. Back then, smartphone data plans and digital streaming services were often a total luxury or just entirely non-existent. Today, they are basic household staples. This new survey finally captures that modern reality.
So the crucial point is what exactly has been added to this modernized basket. Let's sketch out these key bullets. First, and honestly most importantly, rural house rent is included for the very first time. Under the old framework, rural housing was entirely excluded because historically rural homes were largely self-owned, or rent was informally bartered. But with the massive modernization and formalization of rural real estate, paying actual monetary rent is super common now. This specific change drastically improves the accuracy of rural consumption data. Furthermore, the updated index now perfectly follows the latest global classification standards developed by the United Nations Statistics Division, ultimately featuring 12 broad divisions and 43 subgroups.
Section 3. Rebasing the grand total. Let's move inside the GDP.
Gross domestic product, or GDP, is the grand total market value of all final goods and services produced within the entire country. Let's trigger our smaller glossary frame one last time to write out a really vital rule of GDP. Intermediate goods. These are inputs used in the production of final goods. It is incredibly important to understand that intermediate goods are deliberately excluded from GDP calculations. Why? To prevent double counting. Think of it this way. You don't count the value of the raw steel produced at the mill and then turn around and count the full value of the finished car made from that exact same steel. That would be counting the steel twice. You only count the final product.
As we sketch out this final comparison table, you'll see the GDP base year is also moving from 2011-12 to the new 2022-23 standard. The last time India's GDP series was revised was way back in early 2015. The primary purpose of this current overhaul is to finally and accurately align the national accounts with post-pandemic realities and major structural shifts. Think about the massive pivot to the digital economy or the total restructuring of global supply chains that India has actively capitalized on since 2020. The economy changed fundamentally after the pandemic, and this rebasing ensures the grand total accurately reflects those new structural realities.
We've spent this entire explainer looking at the technical mechanics, the base years, the item baskets, and the index weights. But let's just pause for a second, as this question is written on the board.
why does updating a few macro-level spreadsheets actually matter to you? Seriously, why should you care about these dry macroeconomic statistics in your personal life?
Well, the answer is being written right now. True data equals real policy. Let's walk through a little miniature domino effect. If the CPI uses old, outdated data, it might incorrectly say inflation is low. Looking at that, the RBI decides to keep interest rates low. But in reality, because the data is old, your daily groceries are absolutely skyrocketing. You're losing money while the central bank thinks everything is perfectly fine. That is exactly why updating the data matters. By rebasing the IIP and GDP to 2022-23 and the CPI to 2024, the government ensures that policy decisions are actually driven by data reflecting the true, current state of the Indian economy. It completely syncs government policy with your actual wallet. When the government looks at the new IIP, it dictates real infrastructure investments that impact your region. These numbers directly reflect and dictate the reality of your personal loans, your rent, and your daily expenses.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought sketching onto the screen. If our economic reality is just a reflection of the data we collect, what happens when we stop updating the mirror? Thankfully, with this massive modernization by MoSPI, that mirror has just been polished to a high shine, giving us the clearest, most accurate picture of the economy in over a decade. Thank you for watching.